Right now, as you're listening to this, there are over 8 billion humans scattered across every continent on Earth. We're in New York penthouses and Tokyo apartments, on farms in Kansas and fishing villages in Norway, in the Australian outback and the highlands of Peru. We speak 7,000 different languages. We look incredibly different from each other. Our cultures are staggeringly diverse. And yet, here's the thing that should absolutely blow your mind. Every single one of us, without exception, can trace our ancestry back to one continent. Africa, not Europe, not Asia, not some lost continent that sank beneath the waves. Africa, only Africa. Think about that for a second. Humans didn't evolve in multiple places simultaneously. We didn't pop up independently in different corners of the world like some kind of parallel evolutionary experiment. No, the entire human story, everything we are, everything we've built, everything we've achieved, all of it started in one place. And for over a century, scientists have been asking the same question. Why? Why only Africa? What made this one continent the exclusive birthplace of humanity when early primates lived all over the old world? You'd think the answer would be obvious by now. We've sequenced the human genome. We've found thousands of fossils. We've analysed ancient DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans. We've used satellites to track climate changes going back millions of years. Surely with all this technology, all this data, we'd have figured it out. Right? Wrong. Until very recently we were missing something crucial, a final piece of the puzzle that makes everything else make sense, and that's what tonight's story's about. Now, if you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely check them and it's wild. Melbourne at morning coffee, Mexico City at midnight, Manchester at 3 a.m, all listening to the same story at the same time. Kind of beautiful, actually. Here's what we know, and this is the part that's frustrated scientists for generations. Human evolution is weird. Really weird. Most animal species have a straightforward evolutionary history. They emerge in one region, they spread to similar environments, maybe they diversify into a few related species, and eventually either thrive or go extinct. Pretty standard stuff. But humans? We're a biological paradox. We evolved from primates that lived across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, are confined to small regions of Africa. Meanwhile, other primates like macaques and baboons managed to spread across multiple continents. So why did the human lineage, the one that eventually became the most successful species on the planet, only emerge in Africa? What was so special about that one place? For decades, scientists had theories, lots of theories. Maybe it was the climate. Maybe it was the landscape. Maybe it was random chance. Maybe we just haven't found the fossils from human evolution in other places yet. Each theory had some evidence supporting it, but none of them could explain everything. It was like having pieces from different jigsaw puzzles. They didn't quite fit together into a complete picture. Then, starting in 2023, everything changed. A series of groundbreaking discoveries from genetics, paleoclimatology, archaeology, and neuroscience began converging on the same answer. And suddenly, the picture became crystal clear. Scientists weren't just finding new evidence, they were finding the final piece, the one that makes all the other pieces snap into place, and reveal why human evolution could only have happened in Africa. Tonight we're going to walk through this evidence together. We're going to explore what made Africa not just a good place for human evolution, but the only place it could have happened. We'll look at recent genetic discoveries that reveal shocking truths about our ancestors' survival. We'll examine Africa's unique climate patterns that created an evolutionary pressure cooker unlike anywhere else on Earth. We'll dive into the geography that turned the continent into a natural laboratory, perfectly designed for creating intelligent, adaptable, endlessly curious creatures like us. And by the end, you'll understand something that eluded scientists for over 100 years. You'll see why every human alive today carries Africa in their DNA, in their bones, in the very structure of their brains. You'll understand why our origin story couldn't have happened anywhere else. This isn't just about where we came from, it's about understanding why we are the way we are, why we think the way we think, why we survived when countless other human species didn't. The answer has been hiding in plain sight, written in our genes, carved into the African landscape, preserved in layers of ancient sediment, and now, finally, we can read it. So let's go back, way back, to a continent that was about to forge humanity in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Before we can understand why humans evolved only in Africa, we need to establish something absolutely fundamental, something that took scientists over a century to prove beyond any reasonable doubt. We need to understand that Africa wasn't just one of several places where humans evolved. It was the place, the only place. Every single step of human evolution, from the first ape-like creatures that started walking upright to the modern humans who would eventually colonize the globe, happened in Africa. And here's the thing, this wasn't always obvious. In fact, for decades, many scientists thought human evolution happened in Asia. When the first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in Europe in the 1800s, people assumed that was where humanity started. When Peking man was found in China in the 1920s, it seemed to confirm that Asia was the cradle of humanity. Africa was barely even considered. The racism of the era made it almost unthinkable that the birthplace of humanity could be in a continent that European colonizers had dismissed as primitive. But then the fossils started telling a different story. A story so clear, so undeniable, that it would completely overturn everything scientists thought they knew about human origins. The breakthrough came in 1924 when Raymond Dart, an anatomy professor in South Africa, received a box of fossils from a limestone quarry. Inside was a skull, small, childlike, but with features that didn't match any known ape. The tongue child, as it came to be known, was the first discovery of Australopithecus africanus, an ancient human ancestor that walked upright but still had an ape-sized brain. It was 8 million years old, and it had died in Africa. Dart's discovery was met with skepticism, even mockery. How could Africa be important to human evolution? But he was right, and over the next 100 years, every major discovery in human evolution would prove him right again and again. Because here's what happened next. Once scientists started looking seriously in Africa, they couldn't stop finding fossils. Not just one or two lucky discoveries, but thousands of specimens spanning millions of years, and all of them told the same story. The earliest, most primitive human ancestors were in Africa. The slightly more advanced ones were in Africa. The transitional forms between apes and humans, Africa. The first tool users, Africa. The first members of our own genus, Homo. You guessed it, Africa. By the 1960s and 70s, the evidence was becoming overwhelming. Louis and Mary Leakey's excavations at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania were uncovering layers of human evolution like pages in a history book. They found Homo habilis, the first species in our genus, dated to about 4 million years ago. They found stone tools alongside animal bones, evidence of butchery and food processing. They found living floors where ancient humans had camped, made tools, and eaten meals, all of it in Africa, all of it older than anything found anywhere else. Then came Lucy. In 1974, Donald Johanson and his team discovered a nearly complete skeleton in Ethiopia. Australopithecus afarensis, 2 million years old. She was small, just over 3 feet tall, but she walked upright on 2 legs. Her hip bones proved it. Her leg bones proved it. Her foot bones proved it. Lucy was a human ancestor, no question about it. And she had lived and died in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa. The Great Rift Valley. This geological feature, stretching thousands of miles from Ethiopia to Mozambique, became known as humanity's nursery, and for good reason. Nearly every major fossil discovery in human evolution has come from sites along or near the Rift Valley. It's like the Earth opened up specifically to preserve our evolutionary history. Why the Rift Valley? Because rifts create exactly the right conditions for fossilization. The geological activity brings minerals to the surface that help preserve bones. The volcanic eruptions that occur in rift zones bury sites in ash, creating time capsules that can be precisely dated using radiometric techniques. The sedimentary layers that build up in Rift Valley lakes preserve everything that falls into them: footprints, tools, pollen, animal remains, everything you need to reconstruct ancient environments and the creatures that lived in them, and those fossils kept getting older. In the 1990s and 2000s, teams working in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Chad started finding specimens that pushed the human family tree back to 6, then 7 million years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus at 4.4 million years, Aurorin tuganensis at 6 million years, Sahelanthropus chidensis at 7 million years. Each discovery more primitive, more ape-like, but each showing those crucial signs of human ancestry. Changes in the pelvis, changes in the legs, changes in the skull that indicated these creatures were on the path to becoming us. And every single one was found in Africa. By the early 2000s, the fossil evidence was so overwhelming that no serious scientist questioned Africa's primacy anymore. The fossil record clearly showed that human evolution had occurred in Africa for millions of years before our ancestors finally left the continent. But fossils can only tell you so much. They can show you what ancient creatures looked like and approximately when they lived. But they can't prove direct ancestry. They can't show you the unbroken line from ancient apes to modern humans. For that, you need DNA. The genetic revolution of the 1980s and 90s completely transformed our understanding of human origins, and once again, every discovery pointed back to Africa. The breakthrough came in 1987 when Rebecca Cann and her colleagues published a study analyzing mitochondrial DNA from people around the world. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it's passed down only through the mother's line. It doesn't recombine like nuclear DNA. It just accumulates random mutations at a fairly steady rate, creating a kind of molecular clock. When Cann's team analyzed mitochondrial DNA from diverse populations, they found something remarkable. All modern humans traced back to a common female ancestor who lived in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media called her Mitochondrial Eve, and suddenly the genetic evidence was confirming what the fossils had been saying all along. Modern humans originated in Africa. But wait, there's more. In the 1990s, scientists did a similar analysis using Y chromosome DNA, which is passed down only through the father's line. They found Y chromosomal Adam, a common male ancestor of all living humans who also lived in Africa, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Now, Eve and Adam didn't know each other. They lived thousands of years apart, but they both lived in Africa, and every human alive today carries genetic material descended from both of them. The genetic evidence kept piling up. As DNA sequencing became cheaper and more sophisticated, researchers began analyzing nuclear DNA from populations worldwide, and they discovered something that should have been surprising, but actually made perfect sense. African populations have more genetic diversity than all other human populations on Earth combined. Think about what that means. You could sample DNA from people across Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, and you'd find less genetic variation than you would in a single Ethiopian village. Less variation in billions of people spread across 6 continents than in a few thousand people in one African community. This is the diversity paradox, and it's one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for African origins. Because genetic diversity accumulates over time, the longer a population has existed in a place, the more mutations accumulate, the more variation builds up. African populations have the most diversity because they've been there the longest. They are the source population. Everyone else is descended from a tiny subset of Africans who left the continent relatively recently. The numbers are striking. Studies of nuclear DNA show that non-African populations contain only about 5 to 10% of the genetic variation found in Africa. That's not just a little less diversity, that's dramatically less. And it tells us that all non-African populations are descended from a small, founding group that left Africa probably no more than 100,000 years ago. A small group that carried only a fraction of Africa's total genetic diversity with them. This pattern shows up everywhere you look. In immune system genes, in genes affecting skin color, hair texture, and facial features, in genes affecting metabolism, disease resistance, and even personality traits. The most variation is always in Africa. The farther you get from Africa, the less variation you find. It's like tracing a river back to its source. The genetic evidence creates a clear trail leading back to one continent, Africa. But genetic evidence isn't just about diversity, it's also about time. By analysing mutation rates and comparing genetic differences between populations, scientists can estimate when different groups split apart, and the timeline they've reconstructed matches the fossil record almost perfectly. The oldest splits in the human family tree separate different African populations from each other. San and Khoi peoples in southern Africa diverge from other African groups maybe 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. West African populations split from East African ones at various points over the last 100,000 years. Only after all these African divergences do you see the split between Africans and non-Africans, around 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. The genetic evidence is so clear that you can actually see our species' entire history written in patterns of DNA variation. And it all starts in Africa. It all points back to Africa. There is no other interpretation that makes sense. Now let's talk about the archaeological sites that preserved this incredible story. Because the physical places where these discoveries were made aren't just random locations. They're windows into specific moments in human evolution, each one adding crucial details to our understanding of how we became human. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania is probably the most famous. The Leakeys worked there for decades, uncovering layer after layer of human occupation dating back nearly 2 million years. The gorge cut through sediments like a knife through a layer cake, exposing ancient living floors where Homo habilis made stone tools, where Homo erectus butchered animals, where generations of early humans lived, worked, and died. The stone tools found there show technological evolution over time, simple choppers giving way to more sophisticated hand axes, each layer representing thousands of years of refinement and innovation. Homo kibish in Ethiopia gave us something even more important. In 1967, Richard Leakey's team found two partial skulls, Homo I and Homo II, in sediments along the Homo River. For decades, they were thought to be about 130,000 years old. But in 2005, new dating techniques pushed that age back to 195,000 years. These were Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, and they were far older than anyone had expected. Homo kibish showed that our species has been around for at least 200,000 years, all of it in Africa. Then came Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. In 2017, excavations at this site produced the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils yet discovered. 315,000 years old. The skulls showed a mix of modern and archaic features. The face looked modern, but the skull was still somewhat elongated. These were humans in transition, early Homo sapiens who hadn't yet developed all the features we see in living people. But they were making sophisticated stone tools. They were controlling fire. They were doing things only humans do. And they were in Africa, not in Europe or Asia where some researchers had expected to find early humans. In Africa. Pushing the origin of our species back even further in time, and confirming once again that every stage of human evolution happened on this one continent. The timeline this evidence creates is remarkable in its clarity. 7 million years ago, the first hominins diverged from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees in Africa. 4 million years ago, Australopithecines are walking upright through the forests and grasslands of East Africa. 2. 8 million years ago, the first stone tools appear in the archaeological record in Africa. 2. 4 million years, Ago, the genus Homo, emerges in Africa. 1. 9 million years ago, Homo erectus develops and begins to spread, and yes, erectus does eventually leave Africa and colonize parts of Asia. But erectus evolves in Africa first. It's an African species that happens to expand its range. By 800,000 years ago, the genetic bottleneck we discussed earlier has already shaped human evolution in fundamental ways. The populations that survive are all African. They never leave the continent during this crucial period. By 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens are emerging in Africa, still evolving, still developing the features that will make them fully modern. By 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans exist in multiple parts of Africa, and for the next 140,000 years, they stay there. They evolve there. They develop there. They refine the cognitive and cultural capabilities that will eventually let them dominate the planet. But they don't leave. 6 to 7 million years of human evolution, dozens of species in our family tree, hundreds of evolutionary transitions from ape-like ancestors to modern humans. And every single step happens in Africa, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in multiple places simultaneously with different lineages converging on similar solutions, in Africa alone. This isn't just remarkable, it's unprecedented. No other mammal genus shows this kind of geographic restriction for so long. Bears evolved across the northern hemisphere. Cats evolved and spread across multiple continents. Even our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, evolved in Africa but have different ancestral ranges. But humans and all our extinct relatives? We stayed in Africa for millions of years, evolving, diversifying, going extinct and being replaced, all within the boundaries of one continent. Why? Why did human evolution happen only in Africa? Why didn't it happen in Asia, with its vast territories and diverse environments? Why not Europe? Why not the Americas or Australia? That's the question we're going to answer, because now that we've established beyond any doubt that Africa is where human evolution happened, we need to understand what made Africa special. What was it about this one continent that created the perfect conditions for apes to become humans? The answer lies in a unique combination of factors that existed nowhere else on Earth: climate, geography, ecology, predators, all of it coming together to create what scientists now call the perfect evolutionary pressure cooker, a place where natural selection could work its magic over millions of years, shaping our ancestors in ways that would have been impossible anywhere else. And it all starts with something that seems simple but turns out to be incredibly important: Africa's climate. Not just what the climate is, but how it changes, how unpredictable it is, how it creates precisely the right kind of environmental pressure to force rapid evolution. Let's look at that next. Let's talk about climate. Not the boring kind you learned about in geography class, but the kind that literally builds species from the ground up. Because Africa didn't just happen to be where humans evolved. Africa's climate created the specific conditions that forced our ancestors to become what we are today. Between 3 million and 1 million years ago, East Africa experienced something unprecedented in Earth's history. The climate didn't just change, it oscillated, wildly, unpredictably, relentlessly. Every few thousand years, sometimes every few hundred, the entire region would flip between drastically different environmental states. Picture this. Your ancestors are living in a lush forest environment, trees everywhere, reliable fruit sources, predictable water. Life is relatively easy. You don't need to be particularly clever to survive. You just need to know which trees have food and which predators to avoid. Simple, comfortable, evolutionarily stagnant. Then, over the course of just a few generations, maybe 50 to 100 years, the forest starts dying. The trees that have been there for millennia begin to thin out. Fruit becomes scarce. Water sources that have been reliable forever start drying up. The forest is transforming into savanna, open grassland with scattered trees. Everything your ancestors knew about survival is suddenly obsolete. But here's the thing. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened over and over again. Forest to savanna, savanna to forest, wet periods to dry periods, predictable to chaotic. For 2 million years, the East African climate was like a cosmic toggle switch being flipped back and forth by a bored deity. The geological evidence for this is staggering. Lake cores from East Africa show dramatic shifts in vegetation types. Pollen records reveal forests appearing and disappearing on timescales of just a few thousand years. Sediment layers tell stories of massive lakes forming and then evaporating completely, sometimes multiple times in the span of a single human lifetime. This created something biologists call environmental heterogeneity. Not just diversity, but unpredictable, unstable diversity. The kind that doesn't let species get comfortable with any particular survival strategy. Think about what this means from an evolutionary perspective. In a stable environment, natural selection favors specialists, animals that are perfectly adapted to one specific way of life. Pandas eating bamboo, koalas eating eucalyptus, polar bears hunting seals on ice. These species are incredibly good at what they do, but only in their specific environment. Change that environment and they're doomed. But in an unstable environment, specialist reliability, that panda-level specialization that works so well in stable conditions, becomes a death sentence when the environment keeps changing. Natural selection starts favoring something completely different. Generalists, adaptable species that can switch strategies when conditions change. And not just any kind of adaptability, cognitive adaptability, the ability to figure out new solutions to new problems, to learn, to innovate, to plan ahead. This is where the famous savanna hypothesis comes in. For decades, anthropologists believed that the retreat of African forests forced our ancestors out into open grasslands, and that this single environmental shift drove human evolution. Standing upright to see over tall grass, developing tools to hunt on the plains, becoming smarter to survive in a more dangerous environment. But the savanna hypothesis was too simple. It wasn't one shift from forest to grassland that made us human. It was the constant oscillation between environments. The climate kept pulling the rug out from under our ancestors, forcing them to adapt again and again and again. Some generations lived in forests. They developed strategies for forest survival, tool use for accessing certain foods, social behaviors for forest environments. Then the forest would retreat, and their descendants would face savanna conditions. They had to learn completely different survival strategies. How to find water in open country, how to avoid predators with no trees to climb, how to track and hunt animals across vast distances. Then, a few thousand years later, the forest would return. And their descendants had to relearn forest survival all over again. Except this time, they still carried knowledge from the savanna period, technologies and behaviors that could be adapted to forest conditions. Each environmental shift added to the cumulative knowledge base, creating increasingly sophisticated survival strategies. The temperature ranges were perfect for this kind of evolutionary pressure, and I mean perfect in the Goldilocks sense. Not too hot, not too cold, but just challenging enough to push our ancestors without killing them off completely. East African temperatures during this period range from about 15 to 30 degrees Celsius. That's 59 to 86 Fahrenheit for those keeping track. Warm enough that you don't need elaborate shelter or clothing to survive, but with enough variation to create seasonal challenges. Cool nights that required fire management. Hot days that demanded understanding of water conservation. Compare this to other regions during the same time period. Northern latitudes were experiencing ice ages, glaciers advancing and retreating, temperatures dropping so low that survival required very specific adaptations. Thick fur, massive body size, extreme cold tolerance. These conditions produce specialists like mammoths and woolly rhinos. Impressive, but not cognitively flexible. Tropical rainforests, meanwhile, were too stable. Temperatures barely fluctuated. Food sources remained relatively constant year-round. Species in these environments became incredibly specialized to their specific niches. Amazing adaptations, but no pressure to develop general intelligence. East Africa hit the sweet spot, variable enough to prevent specialization, stable enough to prevent extinction. The climate was like a personal trainer that knows exactly how hard to push you. Enough challenge to force adaptation, enough recovery time to consolidate gains. The rainfall patterns were particularly important. East Africa doesn't have steady rain throughout the year. It has distinct wet and dry seasons, and the timing and intensity of these seasons varied dramatically over thousands of years. During wet periods, the region would receive abundant rainfall. Rivers would swell, lakes would expand, grasslands would flourish. Animal populations would explode. For our ancestors, these were times of relative plenty. But they couldn't just relax and enjoy it, because they knew, somewhere in their cultural memory, that the dry times always returned. Dry periods could last years, even decades. Rainfall would drop dramatically. Water sources would become scattered and unreliable. The vast herds would migrate away or die off. Survival during these periods required planning, cooperation, and detailed environmental knowledge. You needed to know where the permanent water sources were. You needed to understand animal migration patterns so you could predict where food would be. You needed technologies for storing and processing food when it was available. Most importantly, you needed social systems complex enough to maintain cooperation during times of scarcity. This is where cognitive development really accelerated. Your ancestors weren't just reacting to immediate conditions, they were thinking ahead, planning for dry seasons during wet seasons, remembering where resources had been during previous cycles, sharing information across generations about long-term environmental patterns. Archaeological evidence supports this. Stone tool caches show up in the record around 2 million years ago. These aren't just random tools scattered across the landscape. They're deliberately placed stockpiles, resources stored for future use. Our ancestors were literally planning ahead, anticipating future needs and preparing for them. The seasonal rainfall patterns also created something else crucial for human evolution: predictable congregation points. During dry seasons, water becomes scarce. Animals and humans alike had to concentrate around whatever water sources remained. These weren't just watering holes. They were meeting places where different groups encountered each other, where knowledge was exchanged, where social networks formed and expanded. Think about what happens when you force multiple groups to share limited resources at predictable locations. You create pressure for communication, negotiation, alliance building. Groups that could cooperate, share information, and maintain peaceful relationships had better access to resources than groups that fought constantly. This social pressure combined with environmental pressure to create a perfect storm of selection for intelligence. You needed to be smart enough to survive environmental challenges and socially sophisticated enough to navigate complex group dynamics. But here's where it gets really interesting. The climate wasn't just variable, it was becoming increasingly variable over time. Between 3 and 1 million years ago, the oscillations were getting faster and more extreme. Environmental conditions that had previously changed every 10,000 years were now changing every 5,000 years, then every 2,000. This is what scientists call the variability selection hypothesis. The idea that it wasn't any specific environment that drove human evolution, but the increasing rate of environmental change itself. Our ancestors weren't adapting to forest or savanna. They were adapting to change itself, developing the cognitive flexibility to handle whatever the climate threw at them. The evidence for this is written in our DNA. Genes associated with brain development show signs of positive selection during exactly this period. Mutations that increased brain size, enhanced neural connectivity, improved learning ability, all these were being selected for with unusual intensity between 2 and 1 million years ago. Your ancestors' brains were literally growing in response to climate instability. Not gradually, not steadily, but in fits and starts that correlate precisely with periods of maximum climate variability. When the environment was most unpredictable, brain growth accelerated. When conditions stabilized temporarily, the pace of change slowed. This wasn't happening anywhere else on Earth. Other continents had their own climate challenges, but none created this specific combination of factors. Let's do the comparison, because it's revealing. Europe and Asia were experiencing ice age cycles, but these were much slower and more predictable than African climate oscillations. Glaciers advanced over tens of thousands of years, giving species plenty of time to migrate or adapt. The selection pressure was for specific cold weather adaptations, not general cognitive flexibility. South America and Australia were largely stable during this period. Tropical rainforests persisted with minimal change. The species that evolved there became incredibly specialized to their environments. Amazing diversity, but not the kind of environmental pressure that drives cognitive evolution. North America had climate variability, but it was the wrong kind. Changes were either too extreme, pushing species to extinction, or too gradual, allowing for slow specialized adaptation. The timing and intensity never hit that Goldilocks zone that East Africa maintained for 2 million years. Even other parts of Africa didn't have the right conditions. West African rainforests were too stable. Southern Africa was too isolated. North Africa was too arid. Only East Africa had the unique combination of factors necessary to forge human intelligence. The rift valleys created microclimates and migration corridors. The proximity to both tropical and temperate zones meant species could track suitable environments without travelling impossible distances. The presence of permanent water sources even during dry periods provided refuges where populations could survive climate extremes. Most importantly, the rate of change was perfect, fast enough to prevent specialization, slow enough to prevent extinction. Our ancestors were always under pressure, always needing to adapt, but never pushed so hard that they couldn't keep up. This created what evolutionary biologists call a ratchet effect. Each generation built on the adaptations of the previous one but never lost ground. When conditions changed, populations didn't have to start from scratch. They could modify existing strategies rather than developing entirely new ones. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this ratchet effect produced cumulative cultural evolution. Knowledge building on knowledge, technologies improving on technologies, social systems becoming more complex generation after generation. By the time modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago, our ancestors had been refining their survival strategies for 2 million years in the most challenging and variable environment on Earth. The climate had created a species uniquely adapted not to any specific environment, but to change itself. We became the ultimate generalists, capable of surviving in almost any condition the planet could produce, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from deserts to mountains, from sea level to extreme altitudes. That adaptability, that cognitive flexibility, that ability to innovate and problem solve, it all traces back to those 2 million years of climate instability in East Africa. The environment didn't just shape us, it forged us, hammered us, refined us like a blacksmith working metal. Each climate oscillation was another strike of the hammer, creating a species harder, sharper, and more resilient than anything that had come before. And the really remarkable thing, the climate was just getting started. Because what happened next would test everything those 2 million years had built. The environment that had created us was about to try to destroy us completely, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get to that catastrophe, we need to understand the other half of the equation. Climate was the forge, but geography was the anvil. And Africa's unique geography created something no other continent could match, the perfect isolated laboratory for human evolution. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because it wasn't just Africa's climate that made us human, it was the continent's unique geography, the way Africa sits on the planet, the way its mountains and valleys and deserts are arranged. This created something that biologists call a natural laboratory, a place where evolution could run experiments that would have been impossible anywhere else. Let's start with the most obvious feature, Africa's isolation. For millions of years during the critical period of human evolution, Africa was effectively an island, not surrounded by water, but surrounded by barriers just as effective. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea and later the expanding Sahara Desert. To the east and west, oceans. To the south, thousands of miles of territory ending in ice-cold waters that early humans had no technology to cross. This meant that whatever evolutionary experiments were happening in Africa stayed in Africa. There was no escape hatch, no easy migration route that would let populations disperse before natural selection had finished its work. Your ancestors were trapped, locked in a continental-scale laboratory where the only way out was to evolve the capabilities needed to overcome those barriers. Think about what this means. In Eurasia, early human populations could always move when conditions got tough. Climate getting too cold in the north, move south. Resources depleted in one region, migrate to another. This constant movement actually slowed down evolution. Why adapt to harsh conditions when you can just leave? But Africa's barriers made leaving impossible. When the climate turned brutal, when resources became scarce, when predators became more dangerous, African populations had two choices: adapt or die. There was no third option. No migration escape valve that could release the evolutionary pressure, and that pressure built up over millions of years, generation after generation of humans facing challenges they couldn't run from, having to develop solutions instead of simply moving to where solutions weren't necessary. This is what evolutionary biologists call a selection trap. But it's a productive trap, the kind that forces innovation instead of extinction. But Africa's isolation wasn't uniform, and that's crucial, because within this isolated continent, geography created something even more remarkable. A patchwork of separated but nearby environments, each acting as its own mini-laboratory, but close enough to exchange genes and ideas when conditions allowed. The key to understanding this is the Sahara Desert. Today we think of the Sahara as a permanent feature. 3.6 million square miles of sand and rock, the largest hot desert on Earth. But it wasn't always there. The Sahara has appeared and disappeared dozens of times over the past few million years. Whenever Earth's climate shifted, whenever rainfall patterns changed, the desert would transform. During wet periods, the Sahara became a green corridor. Grasslands, lakes, rivers, teeming with wildlife. Populations could move freely between North Africa and sub-Saharan regions. Genes could flow. Technologies could spread. Different human groups could meet, interbreed, share knowledge. This is what anthropologists call a dispersal corridor. But here's the brilliant part. These green periods never lasted long. Maybe 5,000 years, maybe 10,000. Then the climate would shift again, and the Sahara would return. Grasslands would die, lakes would evaporate, rivers would disappear, and any populations caught on the wrong side would be isolated again. This created a natural pump for human evolution. Periods of connection, allowing genetic and cultural mixing, followed by periods of isolation, allowing local adaptations to develop. Then connection again, mixing the new adaptations into the broader population. Then isolation again, driving more innovation, over and over for millions of years. No other continent had this feature. Eurasia was too well connected. Populations could always maintain contact, which meant no sustained isolation for local adaptations to evolve. Australia was too isolated and too small, with too little environmental variation to drive complex adaptations. South America was isolated, but it didn't have the right combination of climate pressure and ecological diversity. Only Africa had the Sahara pump. Only Africa had this mechanism for creating and mixing and refining human adaptations over millions of years. But the Sahara wasn't the only geographic feature shaping human evolution. Within sub-Saharan Africa itself, the topography created an even more complex system of barriers and corridors. The Great Rift Valley, that massive geological scar running from Ethiopia to Mozambique, carved up East Africa into a series of distinct ecological zones. On one side of the rift, you'd have highland forests, cool, wet, full of fruit-bearing trees and forest-dwelling animals. Just 50 miles away on the other side, you'd have hot, dry grasslands, completely different vegetation, completely different prey species, completely different survival challenges. And separating them, steep valley walls, fast-flowing rivers, volcanic peaks. Barriers that were easy to see, but hard to cross. This created what biologists call parapatric speciation zones, populations living close enough to occasionally exchange genes, but separated enough that they faced different selection pressures. One group adapting to forest life, developing strategies for arboreal food gathering and dealing with forest predators. Another group adapting to grassland life, learning to track prey across open terrain and avoid savanna predators. But every few generations, some individuals would cross the barriers. They'd interbreed with the other group, mixing forest-adapted genes with grassland-adapted genes, and this is where something remarkable happened. The offspring of these mixed populations often had hybrid vigor. They inherited survival strategies from both environments. This made them more adaptable, more flexible, better able to handle environmental changes. And remember what we said about Africa's climate. It was constantly fluctuating. Forests would turn to grasslands. Grasslands would turn to deserts. Then back again. In this unstable environment, being able to handle multiple habitat types wasn't just advantageous, it was essential for survival. The Rift Valley system provided something else equally important: water, permanent water. Even during the worst droughts, the deep lakes of the Rift Valley system never completely dried up. Lake Turkana, Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika. These weren't seasonal pools that came and went with the rains. These were massive bodies of water fed by underground aquifers and high mountain streams. They persisted through every climate cycle. Why does this matter? Because permanent water sources created refuge zones, places where life could survive even when the surrounding landscape turned to dust. During drought periods, populations would contract toward these water sources. Different groups, different species, all compressed into the narrow belts around lakes and rivers. This created intense competition for resources, driving rapid evolution of intelligence and tool use. You needed to be smart to outcompete other groups for the limited resources near water, but it also created opportunities for knowledge exchange. When times got tough and everyone crowded near the same water sources, technologies could spread rapidly. Someone figured out a new way to process plant foods. That innovation could spread to a dozen different groups in a single generation, because they were all living within a few days' walk of each other. This accelerated cultural evolution far beyond what would be possible if populations were completely isolated. Then, when the rains returned, populations would expand away from the water sources again, taking their new technologies with them, spreading out across the recovered landscape, but still remaining in contact through the trade networks and kinship systems that had formed during the compression periods. The Rift Valley lakes acted as population hubs, places where human groups could survive the worst periods, exchange innovations, and then disperse when conditions improved. Think of them as evolutionary mixing bowls, bringing together different populations during crisis periods, allowing beneficial genes and ideas to mix, then releasing hybrid populations back into diverse environments during recovery periods. No other region on Earth had this combination of permanent water sources and extreme climate variability. In Eurasia, water was either too abundant, meaning populations never had to compress enough for intensive knowledge exchange, or too scarce and unreliable, meaning populations just died out during droughts rather than surviving to exchange innovations. Only in the African Rift Valley did you get this perfect balance. Enough permanent water to create refuge zones, but enough climate stress to force populations together and drive innovation. But we need to talk about the northern barrier, the Mediterranean Sea, because this played a crucial role in keeping human evolution contained in Africa during the most critical periods. Early human populations could see Europe from North Africa. On clear days, standing on the African coast, you could literally look across the water and see the European shore. Just 9 miles of water at the narrowest point. But that 9 miles might as well have been 9,000. Early humans had no boats, no rafts, no technology for crossing even narrow stretches of open water. This created a psychological pressure that might have been as important as the physical barrier. Your ancestors could see a whole other continent, tantalizingly close, potentially full of resources and opportunities, but unreachable. Imagine the frustration, the drive to find a way across. This might have been one of the key pressures driving innovation, the need to develop technologies that could overcome this visible but insurmountable barrier. And eventually they did. But not until they'd spent millions of years trapped south of the Mediterranean, millions of years developing the physical and mental adaptations that made them capable of crossing not just the Mediterranean, but eventually all of Earth's oceans. The barrier that contained them was the same barrier that refined them into a species capable of overcoming all barriers. Within Africa itself, geographic isolation created an even more fine-grained pattern of evolutionary experimentation. Biologists use a principle called island biogeography to explain how species evolve on islands. Small, isolated populations develop unique traits because genetic drift operates more strongly in small groups, and because each island environment creates its own selection pressures. But you don't need actual islands for this to work, you just need isolation. And Africa had plenty of isolation. Not complete isolation, but what biologists call semi-permeable barriers. Mountain ranges with a few passes, river systems with occasional fords, forest grassland boundaries that populations could cross but rarely did. Each of these barriers created what were effectively ecological islands, pockets of territory where populations could remain separate long enough for local adaptations to evolve, but not so separate that they completely diverged into different species. The Rwenzori Mountains between modern Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Virunga volcanoes, the Eastern Arc Mountains of Tanzania, the Ethiopian highlands. Each of these elevated regions created cool, wet environments surrounded by hot, dry lowlands. Populations living in the highlands faced different challenges than lowland populations just 20 miles away. Different foods, different predators, different diseases. This created a mosaic of slightly different human populations, all still the same species, all still capable of interbreeding, but each with its own subtle adaptations, some better at high altitude, some better at dealing with tropical diseases, some better at processing different types of foods, and periodically these populations would mix, Climate changes would shift the boundaries between ecological zones. Populations would expand into new territories or retreat from deteriorating conditions. Each mixing event bring together different adaptive traits, creating new combinations that natural selection could work with. This is the natural laboratory effect in action. Africa's geography didn't just isolate human populations from the rest of the world. It created a complex system of partial isolation within Africa itself. Populations close enough to occasionally exchange genes and ideas, but separate enough that each group faced its own unique selection pressures. Close enough that beneficial innovations could spread relatively quickly, but separate enough that multiple groups could experiment with different solutions to similar problems. Over millions of years, this geographic arrangement allowed Africa to test out thousands of different human variants, different body types, different cognitive adaptations, different social strategies. The ones that worked spread through the meta-population network. The ones that didn't disappeared when their local populations went extinct. But the overall system kept running, kept experimenting, kept refining. By the time our species, Homo sapiens, finally emerged around 300,000 years ago, we weren't just the product of Africa's climate or Africa's predators. We were the product of Africa's geography, shaped by millions of years of isolation punctuated by mixing, refined by countless generations living in semi-isolated ecological pockets, strengthened by the barriers that contained us while we evolved the capabilities needed to overcome those barriers. We are, in a very real sense, children of the Rift Valley, products of the Sahara Pump, survivors of continental-scale isolation, our bodies, our brains, our social instincts. All of them carry the imprint of Africa's unique geographic arrangement, and that geography created something that couldn't have developed anywhere else on Earth. A species smart enough, tough enough, and adaptable enough to eventually leave the natural laboratory and colonize the entire planet. Now, imagine you're one of those early humans stepping out of your shelter at dawn. You're in the African savannah maybe 2 million years ago, and the first thing you need to understand is this. You're not the apex predator. You're not even close. Look around. In the tall grass there's a pride of lions, 20 strong, already scanning for their morning kill. Down by the waterhole, crocodiles wait with prehistoric patience. In the trees, leopards lounge on branches, watching everything below with those calculating yellow eyes. And those are just the cats. There are also hyenas, wild dogs hunting in coordinated packs of 30 or more, massive pythons that can swallow prey whole, and eagles with wingspans that could lift a human child. Africa has more species of large predators than any other continent on Earth, and they're all better at killing than you are. Faster, stronger, better armed with teeth and claws. Evolution gave them millions of years to perfect their hunting strategies while your ancestors were still living in trees. But here's where it gets interesting, because having all these predators trying to eat you, that's exactly what made us human. See, on other continents, early hominids might have faced 1 or 2 major predator species. In Europe, maybe cave bears and wolves. In Asia, tigers and leopards. But in Africa, our ancestors faced the most diverse and sophisticated community of predators the world has ever assembled. Lions that hunt in coordinated groups with complex social hierarchies. Leopards that ambush from above and drag their kills into trees. Wild dogs that chase prey for miles using relay tactics. Crocodiles that learn the daily routines of animals at waterholes and plan attacks accordingly. This wasn't just dangerous. This was an evolutionary pressure cooker that demanded constant innovation just to survive. Every time early humans figured out a defense against one predator, there were 5 more with completely different hunting strategies. You couldn't just specialize, you had to become adaptable, you had to become smart. And that meant learning to think like a predator, to anticipate, to plan, to understand behavior and motivation in ways no other prey species had ever needed to. When you're walking to the waterhole, you don't just listen for lions. You look at the behavior of the gazelles. Are they nervous? Are the birds alarm calling? What direction is the wind blowing? Is it the time of day when leopards typically hunt? Are there thick patches of grass where something could hide? This is theory of mind in action. The ability to model what another creature is thinking, to predict their behavior based on incomplete information. And Africa's predator community forced our ancestors to develop this cognitive skill hundreds of thousands of years before it would have been necessary anywhere else. But the predators were only half the equation, because Africa also had the megafauna, the giant prey animals that would fundamentally reshape human cognition. Picture the African savanna at its peak, maybe 1.5 million years ago. There are elephants, sure, but not the relatively small ones we know today. These are the straight-tusked elephants that stood 14 feet tall. There are multiple species of rhinoceros, some with bizarre horn configurations. There are hippos even larger than modern ones, weighing 4 tons or more. There are buffalo with horn spans wider than a car. And that's not even counting the extinct megafauna. Giant baboons the size of gorillas. Civatherium, a relative of giraffes that looked like a moose crossed with an okapi and weighed nearly a ton. Now, here's the thing about these animals. They're too big for any single predator to take down easily. Even lion prides struggle with adult elephants or hippos, which meant there was this incredible resource, thousands upon thousands of pounds of meat walking around the savannah, but no way for an individual human to access it, unless you cooperated. Hunting megafauna requires planning at a level most animals simply aren't capable of. You need to scout the animal, learn its habits, understand its behavior. You need to coordinate with other humans, sometimes dozens of them, each playing a specific role. You need to manufacture specialized tools, spears strong enough to penetrate thick hide. You need to communicate complex information. Who goes where, when to strike, how to drive the animal toward a cliff or into a swamp. And you need to do all of this while avoiding the dozen other predator species that are also interested in that meat and would happily add you to the menu. This kind of hunting demands cognitive abilities that simply weren't necessary in other environments. In Europe or Asia, early humans could survive pretty well hunting small game and gathering plants. But in Africa, the evolutionary pressure was constant and overwhelming. Either you figured out how to work together to bring down big game, or you starved while watching thousands of calories walk by every day. The archaeological evidence shows exactly when this cognitive leap happened. Around 2 million years ago, we start finding stone tools at kill sites of very large animals. Not just scavenged remains, but evidence of systematic butchery, of multiple individuals working together to process enormous carcasses before other predators arrived. By 500,000 years ago, we see wooden spears designed specifically for hunting large game, found in association with elephant and rhino remains. But there's another aspect to Africa's megafauna that made them uniquely challenging. They evolved alongside humans. This is crucial. On every other continent, when modern humans finally arrived, the local megafauna had never seen anything like us. They had no instinctive fear of these weird, upright apes throwing pointy sticks. So, they were relatively easy to hunt. In fact, Modern human arrival in North America, Europe and Australia correlates pretty precisely with the extinction of most large mammals. We showed up, and within a few thousand years the mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the marsupial lions, all gone. But in Africa, the megafauna had been evolving alongside early humans for millions of years. They knew we were dangerous. They had developed instincts and behaviors specifically to avoid human predation. African elephants are notoriously aggressive toward humans. African buffalo will actively hunt humans who threaten them. Even zebras and wildebeest show sophisticated anti-human behaviors that animals on other continents never developed. This created a cognitive arms race. Humans had to become smarter to hunt animals that were actively adapting to avoid human hunting, and those animals in turn became more intelligent, more alert, more sophisticated in their anti-predator behavior. Back and forth, escalating over millions of years, driving the evolution of intelligence on both sides. African predators were doing the same thing. Unlike animals on other continents, African predators see humans as potential prey. Lions kill hundreds of people every year, even today. In prehistoric times, when we were smaller and less well-armed, we were probably a regular part of their diet. This meant predators were specifically adapting to hunt humans, learning our behaviors, our vulnerabilities, our patterns, and we had to adapt right back. Not just physically, though we did develop some anti-predator adaptations. Things like whites in our eyes that let us communicate direction to other group members silently during dangerous situations. But mainly, we had to adapt cognitively. We had to become better at detecting predators, better at coordinating defense, better at learning from near-miss encounters and teaching that knowledge to our children. This is where language probably became essential. You can show someone how to make a stone tool without words, but explaining that lions tend to hunt near waterholes at dusk, that they approach from downwind, that they target individuals who separate from the group, that requires complex communication, the ability to share detailed information about threats and survival strategies. In an environment with this many ways to die, the groups that could communicate complex information most effectively were the ones that survived. And then there's the scavenging opportunity. Because with this many predators making kills constantly, there were always fresh carcasses scattered across the landscape. Lions kill and eat their fill, then move on. Hyenas come in and clean up more. Wild dogs take a turn, and there, at the end of the scavenging hierarchy, are your ancestors, waiting for their chance. Now, this might sound degrading, eating the scraps left by real predators, but it was actually an incredible learning opportunity. Every kill site was a natural laboratory. Early humans could observe which predators had made the kill, how they had done it, what parts of the prey they preferred, what they left behind. They could learn animal anatomy by examining partially consumed carcasses. They could understand predator behavior by reading the signs left at kill sites, which direction the predators came from, how many there were, when they were likely to return to defend their kill. This turned early humans into forensic ecologists, reading the landscape like a book written in blood and bone. And that skill, that deep understanding of animal behavior and ecology, became fundamental to human cognition. We evolved to be pattern recognizers, story builders, creatures who look at scattered evidence and construct narratives about what happened and what might happen next. That's not just useful for avoiding predators and hunting prey, it's the foundation of all human reasoning, all science, all detective work, all historical analysis. And there's one more way Africa's predators shaped human evolution: disease. Because those predators weren't just large carnivores, They were also parasites, bacteria, viruses, fungi, every microscopic organism that had evolved to exploit warm-blooded prey. Africa has more human pathogens than any other continent. Malaria, sleeping sickness, various hemorrhagic fevers, parasitic worms, bacterial infections that can kill in days. The list is staggering. This created another selection pressure as intense as the visible predators. Humans with robust immune systems survived. Those without didn't. Generation after generation, natural selection refined human immune response to handle an incredible diversity of threats. This is why populations of African descent show higher frequencies of certain immune system variants. Their ancestors needed them to survive in an environment where disease was as dangerous as any lion. But disease pressure did something else too. It rewarded social behaviors that limited pathogen transmission. Groups that developed hygiene practices, that isolated sick individuals, that understood quarantine even before they understood germ theory, those groups had higher survival rates. This might have been another driver of human intelligence, the ability to observe that people who did certain things got sick less often, to pass that knowledge along, to develop cultural practices around cleanliness and disease avoidance. All cognitively demanding tasks that required observation, memory, and the ability to make causal inferences. So, when you put it all together, Africa's predator and prey ecosystem created a perfect storm of evolutionary pressures, diverse predators demanding constant vigilance and innovation, large prey requiring cooperation and planning to hunt, both predators and prey co-evolving alongside humans, creating escalating cognitive arms races, kill sites serving as natural classrooms for learning ecology and anatomy, and disease pressure forcing the evolution of robust immune systems and hygienic cultural practices. No other continent had all these factors operating simultaneously at the same intensity for millions of years. Europe had large prey but fewer predator species. Asia had predators but less megafauna diversity. Neither had the same disease load or the same co-evolutionary history. Only Africa combined all these elements into a single unrelenting pressure that demanded intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability as the price of survival. And that's why, when humans finally left Africa, we were so successful everywhere else. We'd been forged in the most demanding school on Earth. Every other environment seemed easy by comparison. We could outthink predators that had never encountered anything like us. We could hunt megafauna that had no instinctive defenses. We could survive in climates less variable than Africa's, because we had evolved to handle far worse. We were survivors of the ultimate ecosystem, products of millions of years in nature's most demanding classroom, and we carried those hard-won lessons with us everywhere we went, reshaping the world in ways that are still unfolding today. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because all of these environmental pressures, all of this geographic isolation, all of these predators and prey dynamics, they weren't just selecting for stronger bodies or better immune systems. They were creating something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They are building the human mind. Let me paint you a picture. It's 4 million years ago. Your ancestor is standing at the edge of a grassland in East Africa. And I mean actually standing. Not crouching like a chimp, not knuckle-walking like a gorilla, but fully upright on 2 legs. This is bipedalism, and it's absolutely revolutionary. But here's the thing most people don't realize. Bipedalism wasn't some random mutation that happened to work out. It was a direct response to Africa's unique conditions. Think about it. The forests were fragmenting. The climate was getting drier. Your ancestors were spending more and more time moving between scattered patches of trees across open grassland. And in those grasslands, being upright gave you advantages that were literally life and death. You could see over the tall grass to spot predators. You could carry food and infants while you travelled. You could cover longer distances more efficiently because bipedal walking uses less energy than knuckle walking. Most importantly, you freed up your hands, and once your hands weren't needed for locomotion anymore, evolution could start refining them for other purposes. More precise manipulation, better grip, the ability to make tools. 3 million years ago, somewhere in East Africa, one of your ancestors picked up a rock and deliberately struck it against another rock to create a sharp edge. We know this because we've found the tools, simple stone flakes, nothing fancy, but they're unmistakably manufactured. Someone chose those rocks specifically. Someone understood that hitting them together in a particular way would produce a cutting edge. Someone had developed a mental model of cause and effect sophisticated enough to plan and execute a multi-step process. This might not sound revolutionary, but think about what it requires. You need to be able to imagine something that doesn't exist yet. You need to understand material properties, how different rocks fracture in different ways. You need fine motor control to strike at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force. And you need to remember the technique well enough to teach it to others. That first toolmaker was demonstrating abstract thinking, planning, and cultural transmission, all signs of a cognitive revolution that was just beginning. And the revolution accelerated fast. By 5 million years ago, your ancestors weren't just making occasional flakes. They were manufacturing standardized tools. Hand axes with symmetrical shapes, carefully crafted scrapers, sophisticated choppers. Archaeological sites from this period show what anthropologists call the older one tool tradition, a specific set of techniques that spread across East Africa. This is cultural evolution in action, not just individuals figuring out how to make tools, but entire populations sharing techniques, refining methods, passing knowledge down through generations. And it's happening in Africa because Africa's conditions demanded it. See, in the increasingly seasonal African environment, you couldn't always rely on soft fruits and vegetation. Sometimes you needed to process tougher foods, cut meat from carcasses before the scavengers drove you away, crack open bones to get at the nutritious marrow inside, dig up underground tubers during dry seasons when surface vegetation disappeared. Without tools, you starved. With tools, you survived. Natural selection was brutal and efficient. Individuals who were better at making and using tools had access to more calories. More calories meant healthier offspring. Healthier offspring meant your genes spread through the population. But here's where it gets really wild. Those tools weren't just helping your ancestors get food, they were changing their brains. Because there's a direct correlation between tool complexity and brain size in the human fossil record. Around 2 million years ago, just as tool technology was becoming more sophisticated, human brain size started increasing dramatically. Homo habilis, one of your earliest tool-making ancestors, had a brain about 600 cubic centimeters. Within 1 million years, Homo erectus had brains averaging 900 cubic centimeters. Modern humans clock in at about 1,350 cubic centimeters. That's more than doubling brain size in just 2 million years, which is lightning fast in evolutionary terms, and it's happening specifically in Africa, driven by Africa's unique challenges. Because brains are expensive. I mean really expensive. Your brain makes up about 2% of your body weight, but uses 20% of your calories. Growing and maintaining a big brain requires massive energy investment. This is what anthropologists call the expensive tissue hypothesis. You can't just grow a bigger brain without trade-offs. Something else has to give. And what gave was your gut. As your ancestors' brains got bigger, their digestive systems got smaller and simpler. You can see it in the fossil record. Earlier hominins had large, complex guts designed to extract nutrients from tough plant material. Later humans have shorter, simpler digestive tracts. But there's a catch. You can only afford a simpler gut if you're eating higher quality food that's already partially broken down, easier to digest, more nutrient dense, and that means meat. This is where Africa's protein-rich environment becomes absolutely critical. The savanna grasslands supported massive herds of large mammals: antelope, zebra, wildebeest, buffalo. During certain seasons, the biomass of large herbivores on the African savanna was higher than anywhere else on Earth. And where there are herbivores, there are predators. And where there are predators making kills, there are opportunities for scavenging. Your ancestors became systematic scavengers, probably using their tools to quickly slice meat from kills before the original predators or other scavengers could drive them away. Over time, they became hunters themselves, and the more meat they ate, the more they could afford to maintain those expensive growing brains. It's a feedback loop. Better tools allow access to more meat. More meat supports bigger brains. Bigger brains allow creation of even better tools. Round and round, accelerating with each generation. And it's all happening in Africa because nowhere else offered this particular combination of open habitats, abundant large mammals, and environmental pressures that made intelligence the key to survival. But bigger brains alone aren't enough. You also need to know how to use them, and that's where fire enters the story. 1 million years ago, maybe earlier, your ancestors in Africa achieved something no other species had ever accomplished. They learned to control fire, not just use fire when they found it naturally, but actually maintain it, carry it, possibly even create it. The archaeological evidence is scattered across Africa. Burned bones in South African caves, carefully constructed hearths in East African sites, layers of ash in rock shelters that show repeated, controlled burning over thousands of years. This is systematic fire use, and it changed absolutely everything. Fire gave your ancestors control over their environment in ways that would have seemed like magic to earlier hominins. You could cook food, which made it easier to digest and increase the calories you could extract from each meal. You could stay warm during cold nights, extending your range into cooler regions. You could keep predators away, turning vulnerable sleeping sites into safe refuges. You could harden wooden spears, making them more effective hunting weapons. But fire did something even more important. It created a gathering place. Picture your ancestors sitting around a fire as darkness falls. The flames keep lions and hyenas at bay. The warmth is comfortable after a long day of foraging and hunting, and in that protected space, with hours of darkness ahead and nothing to do but wait for morning, they talked. Fire extended the social day. It gave your ancestors time to share information, tell stories, plan for the next day's activities, teach children the complex skills they'd need to survive. Every evening around the fire was a classroom, a strategy session, a cultural transmission event. This is probably where language really started developing. Oh, your ancestors had been communicating for millions of years before this. Gestures, calls, simple vocalizations. But around the fire, with time to spare and complex information to share, language could evolve into something truly sophisticated, and African conditions made language especially valuable. Because survival in Africa's variable environment required accumulating and sharing an enormous amount of knowledge, you needed to know where water sources were during dry seasons, knowledge that might only be relevant every few years. You needed to understand the behavior patterns of dozens of different animals, which ones you could hunt, which ones would hunt you, which ones indicated water or food nearby. You needed to track seasonal changes, predict weather patterns, remember the location of productive foraging sites spread across hundreds of square miles. No individual could hold all this knowledge, but a group that could share information verbally could pool their collective experience. The old woman who remembered the drought 30 years ago could tell young hunters where to find water when the rivers dried up. The man who had survived a lion attack could describe exactly how the predator behaved, helping others avoid the same fate. The mother who knew which plants were poisonous could teach her daughters, who would teach their daughters, preserving life-saving knowledge across generations. Language wasn't just communication. It was a survival technology, maybe the most important one your ancestors ever developed. And like tool-making and fire control, it was refined in Africa's unique pressure cooker of environmental challenges and opportunities. But your ancestors were developing something even more sophisticated than language. They were developing abstract thinking, the ability to conceive of things that don't exist, to think symbolically, to create meaning beyond immediate survival needs. 100,000 years ago, in Blombos Cave in South Africa, someone took a piece of ochre, a red mineral pigment, and carefully engraved geometric patterns onto its surface, cross-hatching, deliberately created designs that served no practical purpose. This is art. This is symbolism. This is evidence of a mind that doesn't just react to the environment but creates meaning within it. Around the same time, archaeological sites across Africa show evidence of people collecting and processing ochre for use as body paint. They were decorating themselves, creating visual distinctions between groups or individuals, using symbols to convey information about identity, status, or affiliation. Why Africa? Why was this cognitive revolution happening here and not in Europe or Asia, where other human populations had spread? Because Africa's challenges required it. In the variable African environment, social cooperation was mandatory. You couldn't survive alone. You needed allies, trade partners, extended family networks that could share resources during times of scarcity. But maintaining those networks required ways of reinforcing group identity and social bonds, shared symbols, rituals, artistic traditions. When you decorated your body with the same patterns as your kin group, you were signaling membership. When you participated in rituals using ochre and other materials, you were reinforcing social connections that might save your life someday. This social complexity was another feedback loop. More complex societies required better communication. Better communication allowed more complex social organization. More complex organization provided survival advantages that selected for even more sophisticated cognitive abilities. And African hunting and gathering conditions made social cooperation especially crucial. Unlike in some other environments where individuals or small families could survive independently, the African savanna required group coordination. Hunting large game meant working together, multiple individuals cooperating to track, surround, and kill animals much larger and stronger than any single human. Gathering also required cooperation. The best food sources were often scattered and unpredictable. Groups that shared information about where they'd found productive foraging sites did better than individuals hoarding knowledge. During dry seasons, groups that shared water sources survived when isolated individuals died of thirst. Natural selection was favoring social skills as strongly as physical abilities. Individuals who could communicate well, cooperate effectively, and maintain strong social bonds had better access to resources, better protection from threats, and more successful offspring. Over thousands of generations, this social selection was shaping the human brain just as powerfully as environmental pressures. The fossil evidence confirms this. As human brains grew larger, they weren't just getting bigger uniformly. Specific regions were expanding disproportionately. The frontal lobes, responsible for planning, decision-making, and social cognition, show the most dramatic growth. The temporal lobes, crucial for language processing, expanded significantly. The parietal lobes, important for tool use and spatial reasoning, became more developed. This is targeted evolution, natural selection, sculpting specific cognitive abilities in response to specific environmental demands, and those demands were coming from Africa's unique combination of challenges: variable climate selecting for adaptability, open grasslands requiring long-distance travel and complex spatial memory, abundant predators demanding constant vigilance and strategic thinking, rich but unpredictable food sources requiring planning and cooperation. By 200,000 years ago, when anatomically modern humans first appeared, in the fossil record they had brains that were fundamentally different from any other creature that had ever lived. Not just bigger, but reorganized, optimized for abstract thinking, language, social cooperation, and technological innovation. These were minds that could imagine things that didn't exist and then create them. Minds that could learn from the experiences of people who had died generations before. Knowledge preserved through cultural transmission. Minds that could form coalitions of hundreds or thousands of individuals bound together by shared symbols, stories, and social obligations. This was the cognitive revolution, and it happened in Africa because only Africa provided the exact combination of conditions necessary to drive it. The environmental variability that rewarded flexibility over specialization, the protein-rich ecosystem that supported expensive brain tissue, the predator pressure that made intelligence more valuable than size or strength, the open habitats that allowed tool use and fire control to provide decisive advantages, the social complexity that made language and symbolic thinking essential for survival. Every aspect of human cognition that makes us unique, every capability that separates us from our closest primate relatives, was forged in the African crucible over millions of years of natural selection. We didn't just evolve in Africa. Africa's specific conditions created us, shaped our minds, built the cognitive toolkit that would eventually allow our descendants to spread across the entire planet and reshape it according to their will. But the revolution wasn't finished yet. One more piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and when it did, it would finally explain why humans evolved only in Africa, and why that African origin would prove to be humanity's greatest advantage. For decades, scientists have been building this story piece by piece. Fossils from Ethiopia, stone tools from Tanzania, genetic samples from populations around the world, each discovery adding another fragment to the puzzle of why humans evolved only in Africa. But here's the thing about scientific puzzles. Sometimes you get 95% of the picture assembled and you think you understand everything. Then someone finds that last 5% and suddenly the whole image shifts into crystal clarity. That's what happened between 2023 and 2024. In January 2023, a team of genomic researchers published something extraordinary in the journal Science. They had analysed DNA from over 290,000 individuals representing every major population group on Earth. Not just looking at current genetic diversity, but using sophisticated computational models to reconstruct the population history of our species going back 2 million years. What they found stopped the scientific community in its tracks. The data showed not one, but multiple severe population bottlenecks in human evolutionary history. But here's what made everyone sit up and pay attention. All of them occurred exclusively in Africa. Every single population crash, every near-extinction event, every genetic bottleneck that shaped our species happened on one continent. And the timing was perfect to explain the unique evolutionary pressures that created modern humans. The most severe bottleneck, the one we've already discussed, occurred around 930,000 years ago and lasted 117,000 years. But the new data revealed something even more fascinating. There were smaller bottlenecks before and after this event. Around 1.2 million years ago, another population crash. Around 600,000 years ago, another squeeze. Each one exclusively African, each one corresponding to climate records showing extreme megadroughts that turned vast regions of the continent into uninhabitable wasteland. Now, population bottlenecks aren't unusual in evolution. Lots of species go through them. But what made these discoveries revolutionary was the comparison data. The same genomic techniques applied to populations of other primates, other large mammals, even other human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans showed completely different patterns. Non-African species showed bottlenecks too, but they were random, scattered, caused by local disasters or isolated climate events. The African pattern was different. It was systematic, repeated, and directly correlated with continent-wide climate cycles that didn't occur anywhere else on Earth. This wasn't just bad luck. This was something unique about Africa itself. Then in August 2023, paleontologists working in the Olorgesailie Basin in Kenya announced a discovery that filled in one of the most frustrating gaps in the fossil record. They had found a nearly complete cranium dated to 760,000 years ago, right in the middle of the recovery period after the Great Bottleneck. The skull was remarkable. It showed features intermediate between the earlier Homo erectus populations and later Homo sapiens. Slightly larger brain case than erectus, but not quite modern. More gracile bone structure, but still robust compared to us. And most tellingly, evidence of rapid evolutionary change. When they compared this skull to others, from the same region dating to 900,000 years ago and 600,000 years ago, they could see evolution happening in fast forward, brain size increasing by 15% over 300,000 years, facial structure becoming more refined, teeth getting smaller, suggesting dietary changes and better food processing. This was direct fossil evidence of the evolutionary transformation triggered by the bottleneck. Proof that those 117,000 years of near extinction hadn't just been about survival. They had been about fundamental biological change. But the real bombshell came from what they found alongside the skull. Stone tools unlike anything seen before at that time period. Not just basic choppers and scrapers, but carefully crafted points designed for specific purposes. Blades with serrated edges for cutting plant fibers, scrapers with precisely shaped working edges for processing hides, and most remarkably, evidence of hafting, the attachment of stone points to wooden handles using plant resins. This technology wasn't supposed to exist 760,000 years ago. According to previous timelines, hafted tools didn't appear until maybe 300,000 years ago. But here was undeniable proof that our ancestors, emerging from the bottleneck, were innovating far earlier than anyone had imagined. They weren't just surviving, They were inventing. Then the climate scientists weighed in with their own revelations. Using new computational models that could simulate ancient weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy, researchers reconstructed the climate of Africa over the past 2 million years and compared it to conditions on every other continent during the same period. The results were unambiguous. Africa experienced climate variability that was literally off the charts compared to anywhere else. Europe had ice ages, sure. Asia had monsoon cycles. The Americas had their own regional climate patterns. But none of them came close to the extreme, rapid, unpredictable climate swings that characterized Africa during the critical period of human evolution. The models showed megadroughts in Africa that lasted thousands of years, reducing rainfall by 80% or more across regions the size of Western Europe. Then sudden reversals, with monsoon systems shifting and turning deserts back into grasslands in just a few decades. This kind of climate whiplash created exactly the conditions for rapid evolutionary change. Populations had to adapt quickly or die, but here's the crucial detail that the models revealed. These extreme conditions were caused by Africa's unique position relative to global ocean currents and atmospheric circulation patterns. The continent sits astride the equator, bracketed by two major ocean systems, influenced by multiple monsoon patterns and critically affected by changes in ocean temperature that other continents were buffered from. This meant the extreme climate variability wasn't a fluke. It was a permanent feature of African geography. No other continent was positioned to experience the same conditions. No other landmass could have created the same evolutionary pressure cooker. If you wanted to design a continent specifically to force rapid human evolution, you couldn't do better than Africa during the Pleistocene. The archaeological evidence kept piling up. In 2024, excavations at multiple sites across East and South Africa revealed something that forced a complete rethinking of human behavioral evolution. At sites dating to 800,000 years ago, right after the bottleneck, researchers found evidence of behaviors previously thought to be much more recent. Ochre processing, the grinding of red iron oxide minerals to create pigments. This suggests symbolic thinking, the use of colour for communication or decoration, collection of seashells far inland, indicating trade networks or at minimum, long-distance travel. Evidence of controlled fire used not just for warmth or cooking, but for systematic landscape modification. Our ancestors were using fire to clear brush, encourage growth of specific plant species, and manage animal populations. This was sophisticated ecological engineering 800,000 years ago. These weren't primitive survivors scratching out a bare existence. These were intelligent, forward-thinking humans, actively managing their environment to create the conditions they needed to thrive. And all of it was happening exclusively in Africa, hundreds of thousands of years before similar behaviors appeared anywhere else. But perhaps the most profound discoveries came from comparative studies with other primates still living in Africa. Researchers studying chimpanzees, gorillas, and baboons across the continent noticed something remarkable. These species also showed genetic signatures of population bottlenecks corresponding to the same megadroughts that had nearly wiped out early humans. But they had responded differently. Chimps became more conservative, sticking to proven survival strategies in refugia. Gorillas became more specialized, focusing on specific food sources they could defend. Baboons became more aggressive, using social dominance to control access to scarce resources. Only humans responded by becoming more innovative, more cooperative, more willing to experiment with new technologies and social structures. This told scientists something crucial about the evolutionary outcome. The African environment created the pressure, but it was something unique about the human lineage, something in our genetic makeup or cognitive architecture, that translated that pressure into the specific adaptations that made us modern humans. Same environment, different species, completely different evolutionary trajectories, and that observation helped demolish the last remnants of the multi-regional hypothesis. For years, some researchers had argued that modern humans didn't evolve exclusively in Africa. Instead, they proposed that Homo erectus populations spread across Africa, Europe and Asia around 2 million years ago, and then evolved into modern humans simultaneously in multiple locations, exchanging genes occasionally but developing modern characteristics independently. It was an elegant idea. But the new evidence killed it dead. The genomic studies showed conclusively that all modern human populations share recent common ancestry in Africa. Not 2 million years ago, but less than 300,000 years ago. The genetic diversity patterns are unmistakable. African populations show the deepest, oldest lineages. Non-African populations are all descended from a small group that left Africa recently, carrying only a subset of African genetic diversity. The fossil evidence backed this up. Every attempt to find transitional fossils showing local evolution from Erectus to Sapiens outside Africa had failed. The skulls don't show gradual change from archaic to modern features. Instead, they show archaic humans living in Europe and Asia, then suddenly being replaced by modern humans who appear fully formed in the archaeological record. The climate modelling explained why this had to be the case. Those unique African conditions, the extreme climate variability, the repeated bottlenecks, the constant pressure for innovation, they simply didn't exist anywhere else. Europe and Asia had their own challenges, absolutely, but they were different kinds of challenges that selected for different adaptations. Neanderthals became cold-adapted specialists. Denisovans became high-altitude and maritime specialists. Modern humans, forged in the African crucible, became generalist survivors capable of adapting to anything, and that difference was everything. The 2024 studies also revealed something unexpected about those ancient mega-droughts. They weren't just disasters, they were innovation engines. By analysing archaeological sites before, during and after major drought periods, researchers could track technological change in real time. And what they found was remarkable. Stone tool complexity increased dramatically during drought periods, not after, during. When conditions were at their worst, when survival seemed most uncertain, that's when humans innovated most rapidly. New tool types appeared, new food processing techniques emerged, new hunting strategies developed. It was as if the pressure of near extinction stripped away conservative traditions and forced experimentation. Then, when conditions improved, these innovations persisted and spread. The technologies developed during crisis periods became the baseline for the next generation. Each drought ratcheted up the sophistication of human culture another notch. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this cycle of crisis and innovation transformed simple Stone Age survivors into beings capable of abstract thought, symbolic communication, and technological mastery. But here's what really brings it all together. All of these recent discoveries, the genomics, the fossils, the climate models, the archaeology, they don't just confirm that humans evolved in Africa. They explain why humans could only have evolved in Africa. Why no other continent could have produced our species. You needed the climate extremes to create the selection pressure. You needed the geographic diversity to provide refugia during crisis periods. You needed the ecological richness to reward innovation when conditions improved. You needed the specific configuration of ocean currents and atmospheric patterns that made Africa's climate uniquely variable. You needed the megafauna that forced development of sophisticated hunting strategies. You needed the disease environment that selected for robust immune systems. You needed all of it, all at once, operating together for millions of years. No other place on Earth had that combination. No other continent could have done it. Africa wasn't just where humans happened to evolve. It was the only place where we could have evolved. The final piece of the puzzle wasn't another fossil or another gene sequence. It was understanding that the puzzle could only have one solution, that every piece, every discovery, every line of evidence points to the same inescapable conclusion. We are an African species, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by the fundamental laws of evolution operating in a unique environment that shaped us into what we are today. And now, finally, we can see the complete picture. So let's address the question you're probably asking. If the conditions in Africa were so perfect for human evolution, could it have happened somewhere else? Could Asia have produced humans? Europe? What about the Americas or Australia? It's a fair question, and the answer is fascinating. Because when you actually look at the specifics, when you examine what every other continent had or didn't have during the critical period, you realize something incredible. Nowhere else on Earth could have done it, not even close. Let's start with Asia. At first glance, Asia seems promising. It's enormous, spanning multiple climate zones from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. It has diverse ecosystems, plenty of animals, mountain ranges, river valleys, everything you'd think would be necessary for human evolution. But here's what Asia didn't have: the right kind of instability. See, for most of the past 10 million years, Asia's climate has been relatively stable. Not unchanging, but stable in a way that didn't create the intense selection pressure necessary for rapid brain evolution. Sure, there were ice ages and warm periods, but the transitions were gradual. Populations had time to migrate, to find new territories when conditions changed. There was no forcing function, no environmental pressure cooker that demanded adapt or die on the timescale necessary to drive brain expansion. Even more importantly, Asia didn't have the right primate starting material. By the time conditions might have favored human-like evolution, the primates that had colonized Asia millions of years earlier had already specialized. They'd become langurs, macaques, gibbons, each perfectly adapted to their ecological niche. They weren't generalists anymore. They'd committed to specific survival strategies that worked great for their environments, but left no room for the kind of radical evolutionary experimentation that produced humans. And then there's geography. Asia is massive, but it's also divided. The Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, vast deserts. These barriers would have fragmented any proto-human population so completely that the metapopulation structure we talked about earlier, that network of connected but separated groups, couldn't have formed. Populations would have become isolated for so long they'd have specialized into different species, losing the genetic cohesion necessary for the kind of rapid evolutionary change that produced us. There's also the timing problem. By the time environmental conditions in Asia might have favored human-like evolution, Africa had already been running the experiment for millions of years. African hominins had a massive head start, and evolution isn't a race you can catch up in. Once one population gets significantly ahead in brain size and tool use, they have enormous competitive advantages that make it nearly impossible for other species to catch up. Now let's look at Europe. Europe has an even bigger problem: temperature. For most of the period when human evolution was happening in Africa, Europe was experiencing repeated glaciation cycles that made large parts of the continent uninhabitable. During peak glacial periods, ice sheets extended down to what's now London and Berlin. The habitable zones were squeezed into narrow refugia around the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast. These weren't conditions that favoured the evolution of large-brained primates. Large brains are metabolically expensive. They require enormous amounts of calories, stable food supplies, and environments that reward intelligence over other survival strategies. Ice Age Europe rewarded physical robustness, cold adaptation, and efficient metabolism. Not the kind of environmental conditions that select for bigger brains and more complex social behaviour. But here's the real kicker. Europe didn't have any great apes. When the critical period for human evolution was beginning, around 7 or 8 million years ago, there were no African ape populations in Europe to evolve from. The primate populations that did exist there were primitive by comparison, and they went extinct during the climatic deterioration that preceded the ice ages. By the time Europe might have been suitable for human evolution, it was already too late. Africa had already produced the entire hominin lineage, and those African species were already expanding into Europe as immigrants, not evolving there independently. The Americas present an even clearer case. North and South America had no great apes at all, not during the critical period, not ever. The closest relatives to African apes in the Americas were New World monkeys, which had diverged from our lineage something like 40 million years ago. They were separated from us by an evolutionary gulf so vast that no amount of selection pressure could have bridged it in the time frames we're talking about. Even if the climate and geography had been perfect, which they weren't, there was simply no starting material. You can't evolve humans from capuchin monkeys any more than you can evolve birds from lizards. The developmental toolkit isn't there. The genetic architecture is completely different, and by the time any great apes reached the Americas, they were already humans, already fully evolved, walking across the Bering Land Bridge around 15,000 years ago as modern Homo sapiens. The Americas also had their own timing problem. They were isolated from Africa and Eurasia for the entire period of human evolution. There was no exchange of populations, no gene flow, no opportunity for the kind of genetic mixing and competition that drove innovation in Africa. Whatever evolved there would have been on a completely separate evolutionary trajectory, and the fossil record shows us exactly what that trajectory produced. Interesting and diverse mammalian fauna, but nothing remotely approaching human intelligence. Australia might be the most dramatic example of how isolation affects evolutionary outcomes. Here's a continent that's been largely isolated for 50 million years since it broke away from Antarctica and drifted north. And what evolved there? Marsupials. Incredibly diverse, beautifully adapted marsupials that filled ecological niches similar to placental mammals on other continents, but no primates at all, not even primitive ones. The ancestors of primates never reached Australia before it separated from the other land masses, so there was literally zero chance of human evolution happening there. The developmental starting point was missing by tens of millions of years of evolutionary divergence. You could give Australia another 100 million years of perfect conditions, and it still wouldn't evolve humans independently because the basic genetic architecture isn't there to work with. But all of this raises a deeper question. Why did only Africa have the right primates to begin with? This is where we need to talk about the primate prerequisite, and it takes us back even further in time. Around 23 to 5 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch, Africa experienced something unique. A combination of climate conditions, forest coverage, and geographic positioning that allowed primates to diversify in ways they couldn't anywhere else. The continent had extensive tropical forests that provided the complex three-dimensional environment where primate traits like grasping hands, stereoscopic vision, and large brains first evolved. But it also had enough climatic variability to create selection pressure for adaptability rather than over-specialization. This created what evolutionary biologists call an adaptive radiation. Primates exploded into dozens of different forms, experimenting with different body sizes, different diets, different social structures. Some became specialized leaf eaters, others focused on fruits. Still others developed omnivorous diets that required them to remember the locations of scattered food resources and coordinate with group members to exploit them efficiently. It was from this diverse community of Miocene African primates that great apes emerged. Not in Asia, not in Europe, not anywhere else, in Africa. And crucially, these early great apes retained a kind of evolutionary flexibility, a lack of over-specialization that would prove essential millions of years later when conditions began favoring even larger brains and more complex behavior. By the time the climate began shifting toward the conditions that would drive human evolution, Africa had populations of great apes that were already generalists, already comfortable on the ground as well as in trees, already living in complex social groups, already using their hands for manipulation and their brains for problem solving. They were pre-adapted, not for human evolution specifically, but for the kind of rapid evolutionary change that environmental pressure would soon demand. No other continent had this. Asia had primates, but they'd already specialized. Europe had lost its great apes. The Americas and Australia never had them at all. Only Africa had the right starting material at the right time. But even having the right primates wasn't enough. You also needed the right timing. And this is where things get really specific. The climate shifts that drove human evolution, the ones we talked about earlier, the fragmentation of forests, the expansion of grasslands, the increasing variability and unpredictability, these happened in Africa during a very specific window of time, between about 8 million and 2 million years ago. This timing mattered because it came after African apes had diversified, but before they'd become over-specialized. It came at a point when their brains were already larger than most mammals, giving them the cognitive foundation to evolve even further. It came when their social structures were already complex enough to support cultural learning and knowledge transmission across generations. In Asia, similar climate shifts happened at the wrong times, either too early, before primates had evolved to the great ape level, or too late, after populations had already specialized. In Europe, the shifts were too extreme, the ice ages too severe to support the kind of continuous evolutionary pressure that built bigger brains gradually over millions of years. This brings us to what I call the confluence factor. Human evolution didn't just require the right primates, or the right climate, or the right geography. It required all of these things simultaneously in the same place. It required a perfect storm of conditions that aligned in one location during one specific window of time. Think about what had to happen. You needed a continent with diverse great ape populations that hadn't over-specialized. Check, only Africa had that. You needed climate change that was intense enough to create strong selection pressure, but not so extreme that it caused extinction. Check. Africa's position spanning the equator gave it that perfect balance. You needed geographic diversity that could fragment populations into isolated groups while still allowing occasional genetic exchange. Check. Africa's patchwork of forests, grasslands, mountains, and rift valleys provided exactly that structure. You needed predators that were dangerous enough to select for intelligence and cooperation, but not so overwhelming that they prevented ground-dwelling populations from surviving. Check. Africa had the right mix of big cats, hyenas, and wild dogs. You needed prey animals that were challenging enough to hunt, that they rewarded intelligence and tool use. Check. Africa had the most diverse and abundant megafauna on the planet. You needed all of this to continue for millions of years, long enough for multiple rounds of selection, speciation, and innovation to occur. And crucially, you needed the populations that emerged from this process to remain in contact with the source populations in Africa, allowing them to receive fresh genetic input and preventing them from becoming evolutionary dead ends. Only Africa had all of this. Only Africa could have done it. Every other continent was missing at least one critical piece of the puzzle, usually more. Asia had the wrong primates and too much stability. Europe was too cold and arrived too late. The Americas and Australia were isolated and had no great apes at all. This isn't African exceptionalism or geographic determinism. It's just the facts of biology, climate, and geography. Human evolution required a very specific set of conditions that happened to align in one place during one period of time. We didn't evolve in Africa because Africans were special. Africans are special because we evolved in Africa. Because that's where the prerequisites aligned. Because that's where the experiment could run to completion. And here's the final piece that makes this undeniable. It only happened once. In 4 billion years of life on Earth, with millions of species and countless opportunities, human-level intelligence evolved exactly one time in one place from one lineage. Not convergently in multiple locations, not in multiple groups independently discovering the same solution. Once, in Africa, from African apes. During that specific window of climatic and geographic conditions. That's not coincidence. That's evidence that what happened in Africa was extraordinarily unlikely, the result of conditions that were probably unique in Earth's history. We exist because everything aligned perfectly in one place at one time, and that place was Africa. So here we are. After everything we've explored, all the climate disasters and evolutionary pressure, all the extinct species and bottleneck events, all the predators and prey and desperate survival, we come back to the same incredible truth. Africa made us human. Not just technically, not just as a place where our species happen to evolve, but fundamentally. Every single thing that makes us human, our intelligence, our adaptability, our capacity for cooperation, our ability to create art and technology and language, all of it was forged in Africa's unique crucible. Think about what had to converge for this to happen. The climate instability that forced rapid adaptation or death. The geographic isolation that prevented our ancestors from simply migrating away when things got tough. The predator pressure that made us smarter instead of stronger. The ecological diversity that rewarded behavioral flexibility over physical specialization. The timing of it all, with each challenge arriving exactly when our ancestors were ready to respond to it. Change any one of these factors and humans probably never evolve. Move the story to Europe and our ancestors just migrate south during ice ages, never developing the adaptations that make us unique. Set it in Asia, and the geographic scale is too vast, population spread out too much to maintain the selection pressure needed for rapid evolution. Put it anywhere else on Earth, and the combination of pressures just isn't right. Only Africa had everything. Only Africa could have done this. And here's what that means. Every person listening to this, wherever you are right now, whatever you look like, whatever language you speak, you are African. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Your ancestors survived that 117,000-year bottleneck. They endured droughts that lasted centuries and volcanic winters that blocked out the sun. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups and share knowledge across generations. They developed the first tools, the first art, the first abstract thinking. They carried chromosome 2 fused in the middle, marking them as survivors of the greatest crisis in human history. And then, when the climate finally improved, they spread across the world, carrying Africa with them. Every step they took, from the Rift Valley to the Arabian Peninsula, from India to China, from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, they were bringing African adaptations to new environments. African intelligence solving new problems, African resilience facing new challenges. The relatively minor differences we see between human populations today, skin colour, facial features, body proportions, these evolved in just the last 60,000 years. They're superficial adaptations to local conditions, minor variations on African themes. But the things that really matter, the cognitive abilities that let us dominate this planet, the social intelligence that lets us build civilizations, the creativity that produces art and science and philosophy, that's all African. That's all ancient. That's all shared by every human being who has ever lived. This isn't just interesting history. This is knowledge that should fundamentally reshape how we think about human diversity and human unity. When you look at another person, any person, regardless of how different they might seem, you're looking at another African, another descendant of those 1,280 survivors, another carrier of genes that were tested and refined by the harshest conditions imaginable. We are literally all family, not distant cousins but close relatives separated by just a few hundred generations. The genetic differences between any two humans are vanishingly small compared to the similarities. We share almost everything that matters, and we're still learning. Right now, right this moment, researchers across Africa are uncovering new evidence about our origins. New fossil sites in Morocco, Chad, Kenya, South Africa, each one revealing another piece of the puzzle. Genetic studies finding new evidence of ancient bottlenecks and population movements. Archaeological discoveries showing how our ancestors developed technology and culture. Africa hasn't finished teaching us about ourselves. Every year brings new revelations, new understanding of how this extraordinary continent shaped everything we are. Africa was our birthplace, but it was also our proving ground. The place where random apes became thinking beings, where survival required not just strength but intelligence, not just instinct but innovation, where the challenges were so intense that only the most adaptable, most cooperative, most creative individuals could pass on their genes. We're the result of that proving ground. Every one of us. We carry Africa in our DNA, in our minds, in the very structure of our chromosomes. And that's not where our story ends. That's where it begins. Because everything humans have accomplished since leaving Africa, every civilization we've built, every technology we've invented, every work of art we've created, it's all been possible because of what Africa made us. We are all Africans. We are all survivors. We are all carrying the legacy of the greatest evolutionary story ever told. If this video gave you a new perspective on human origins and our shared heritage, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and let's see how far across the world our African family has spread. And subscribe because there's so much more to explore about how we became who we are. Remember, every human alive today carries Africa within their DNA. We're not just from Africa, we are Africa, scattered across the world but forever connected by the journey that made us human. Now get some rest. You've earned it.